Hello, hello. It's the Japan Zoomina from UC San Diego's School of Global Policy and Strategy. It's February 18th, 2025. I am Ulrike Schaede, professor and director of the Japan Forum for Innovation and Technology here at UC San Diego. Today's discussion will be of my new book. I'm actually going to be in the hot seat, and putting me there will be my guest, Brad Glosserman. I will introduce Brad momentarily. Let me briefly tell you where we are while the Zoom participants are still finding their seats. So GPS is our school, School of Global Policy and Strategy. We have over 400 students and over 46 faculty now. We're growing. We have 8 degrees, including a Master of International Affairs with a Japan specialization. Please look us up at gps.ucsd.edu. And JFIT is our Japan Center where we do a lot of fun things. You can follow us or you can go to our website at jfit.ucsd.edu. This Zoomina is a regular thing we do, and we do have many regulars on the show today. But let me, for those of you who are new, let me explain real quick. Feel free to type any questions you might have into the Q&A box. We will refer to you only by your first name to protect your privacy. If we don't get to answering your Q&As today, I will review them after the show and see whether I can answer you directly by email. The good news on the recordings is that, yes, we have a library called JZ Gallery, and you can find links to past events at jfit.ucsd.edu/Zoominar. So this winter schedule, we had Philip Lipsky, then Michael Beeman, and me. Today is the last event of the quarter. We'll go to spring break and be back in April. And last but not the least, therefore, we are doing our final spring winter quarter thing with Brad, my old standing friend and discussion partner. So let me stop this PowerPoint thing and introduce Brad. Here he is. Hey, Brad. Good morning, good evening, wherever you are. So let me introduce Brad. Brad's a deputy director and visiting professor at Tama University at the Center for Rulemaking Strategies. That is, Tama is in Tokyo. He's also the senior advisor of the Pacific Forum International in Honolulu, where he has been for more than, this would date us, but okay, 16 years, something like that, as director of research and executive director. Between 1991 and 2001, he was a member of the editorial board of the Japan Times, and to this day, he's a contributing editor of the JT. And he has written many very interesting books, and if you don't know these books, you may want to look. There is the Japan-South Korea Identity Clash with Scott Snyder that he published in 2015. 2019 was Peak Japan, which is actually the opposite of my message, but okay, we are both right, actually. That's part of the interesting part of the story. Then last year, with Gil Rosman, he published Japan's Rise as a Global Power, 2013 to 2023. That's a must read. And getting ready to get out there on the market is his new book, Geopolitics of High Technologies, something like that. All right, Brad got his BA from Reed College and a son named Reed, so there's something there. An MA from John Hopkins and a JD from George Washington University. Thank you, Brad, for joining me. It's really great to have you.
Always a pleasure. Delighted to share the screen with you, Ulrike.
Oh. Yeah, and maybe I should tell the audience that we go back to the 1980s or something like that, when we were both trying to figure out what Japan was really all about. So, all right. So the plan for today is actually that we will talk about my latest book, and Brad has been influential in not only how it's positioned and written, but also how it's published, because it's self-published through Amazon, and that is an experiment that we're both looking forward to, kind of talking about. But before we start, let me give you a brief rundown on what's in the book. So I hope you can see this red and white thing. Japan Reemerges is the title. By the way, the title page was inspired by the Tokyo subway, where they had this unhappy-looking dragon being squeezed for a trying to jump into the train before the doors closed. And we turned that into a happy dragon with the help of a local artist named Chris Floyd. So I'm really grateful to Chris, making people laugh. All right, so Japan Reemerges is actually sort of the fourth of a sequel. In 2020, there was the Business Reinvention of Japan, which was translated into Japanese. A former student, Oishi-san, who actually did a Zoominar with me a year ago, said, yeah, that book is nice and academic and all that, but it's too complicated. Write a simpler one, give us hope. So I wrote a Japanese pocketbook, a shinsho, titled Shin Nihon no Kei, the New Japan Management. And the Shin is like the Shin Godzilla, so there was a play there on the new. And when I learned in the process that when you publish a book in Japanese, the author keeps the copy edit rights, copyrights. So I had this book sitting there, and then I thought I should publish this in English, but I need to transpose it because the little book was actually written for the Japanese reader, and so I transposed this thing, and Japan Reemerges is the transposed English version of that Japanese book. The bottom line or main storyline is that the stagnation narrative of Japan is a narrative based on US assumptions of what constitutes a quote unquote good economy. And namely a fast moving, fast rolling, fast growing thing. Japan has a different definition of a good economy, or can be seen as having a different definition of a good economy. And if we tell the narrative from that point, then the last 30 years were not so much stagnation, but a period of system transformation. And the main storyline that I will now introduce is that Japan is, of course, no longer a catching up follower of whatever technologies are invented elsewhere, but rather a contributor at the technology frontier. And I will explain that in a moment. This transition from a follower to a competitor at the tech frontier took 30 years because Japan made different trade-offs than we would be used to be making in the United States. Namely, that the stagnant GDP growth or the slow GDP growth or whatever you want to call it, something that Americans think is bad, was actually a choice. It was the price that Japan paid to maintain employment and social stability. That was very expensive. 30 years of stagnant GDP growth is very expensive. But one could argue that the trade-offs that the United States has been making over the last 10, 20, 30 years may be even more expensive. And so the bottom line here is slow is not stagnant. Japan works at a different pace, and that could be a good thing. And in any event, after 30 years of transformation, the results are beginning to show now. We see this in the stock price being higher, whatever the stock price means, it's higher. And last quarter GDP growth was actually 2.8% or something. All right, so the motivation of this all is that whenever I come to Japan, and for all of you who live in Japan, you know, there's only bad news. It's like bad. And in fact, there's a whole generation of 30-year-old Japanese who believe that this is the only story there is. But if it is the only story there is, we have some problems explaining why, for instance, Japan, after 30 years of no growth, is still the third or fourth largest economy in the world measured by GDP. GDP is a crappy measure anyway, but there's also this. The Harvard Growth Lab has produced a ranking since 1995 of what they call the productive knowledge of a nation. And what they do there is they take the export basket of all countries in the world and they look at how complex and how common these products are. So a t-shirt is simple to make. Many countries can make it. You get a really low score for that. A specialty chemical for semiconductor production is very difficult to make. Very few countries can make it. You get a high score. And this is the ranking. And so drumbeat, right? Japan has been #1 in the world in the complexity of its export basket for the last 30 years. And we have some explaining to do if the US version of the story of a stagnant Japan is the only version there is, there's got to be another story to be told. And so I set out to try to explain this sort of thing, not the negative stuff, but the stuff that's actually working. And so there are these two narratives, right? So there's the what the Japanese also now call the Nihon Dame Dameron, which is Japan has lost it. After the bubble, the country collapsed. There was an ice age. The economy was filled with zombie farms. It's doomed. And again, as I mentioned earlier, this is based on the assumption of a good economy as one that growth year on year. And by the way, if you push the economists, they'll tell you that they use GDP, although they know it's a crummy measure, they use it because it's the only thing that they can measure. All right, so how about an alternative narrative? And in this slow is not stagnant narrative, Japan did catch up, so it starts at the same point. It's now a technology leader. Just when that happened in the 1990s, the rise of the regional competitors, South Korea, Taiwan, and then China, challenged Japan's old business model. And I'll explain what that business model was and how it got challenged. And the front runners then were actually, even Japan's best companies, which I call the front runners, were greatly held back in the speed at which they could change by regulations and social expectations on employment and non-regular employment, which was deplored as a bad thing, and how could companies do this? So they were actually held back, but in the old days, Prime Minister Koizumi changed the laws, and eventually, beginning at around 2005, the companies that wanted to change could actually change. The underlying assumption of this narrative is what matters is balance, and we can talk a little bit more about that balance later. All right, so now you might think, well, how can both of these narratives be true? And I think they can actually be true if you think of Japan as an expression of the 80-20 rule, where 20% of inputs explain 80% of outputs. And so Japan not has a lot of bad companies, and Japan has a lot of problems. And I'm not saying that Japan is wonderful. It isn't, right? It has its own set of problems. And at the end, I will ask you, which problems would you rather have? Japan's or your own countries? So I grew up in Germany. I'd rather have Japan's problem than Germany's problem. But um, so a fairly small group of companies in Japan explain 80% of this outcome. And I set out to study those good companies and what we can learn from them, because the hope then would be that if we get more of these good companies, then the entire economy will eventually do better. All right, so let's go to this is the main sort of the main concept, which I've called Japan Inside. Like you may remember the Windows computers. I think still to this day they have a little sticker saying Intel inside. Right? So here what I do to explain this is I have a supply chain of a manufactured good. It starts with the design, then there are some input parts, there's assembly, logistics, and retail. In the old days, 40 years ago, companies would do that all in one, either in-house or in one area of their own country. When shipping costs declined in the mid-1990s, it actually made sense to globalize this thing and put these portions of the value chain wherever it was cheapest to do them. And then also at around 1995, the CEO of Acer, the Taiwanese computer company, apparently in an izakaya somewhere over a beer, drew this other thing that I have here, which is a measure of profits, operating margin or something, on the vertical axis and over the phases of production, and he drew this what come to be known as the smile curve. And the problem with the smile curve for Japan, can I show this here? Is anyway, so I can maybe, is that the assembly portion used to be Japan's bailiwick. The Toyota production system, all of that is just the assembly portion, right? And when China decided to become the assembler of the world, it basically wiped out the profits in what used to be Japan's sweet spot. So Japanese companies said, okay, we're always going to be in monozukuri nation, okay, but we can't make toaster ovens and hair dryers and so forth and so on profitably. So we need to move. And they moved either upstream into the advanced inputs or downstream into logistics and retail. So I can tell the story also for banks and so forth and so on, but for this particular project, I focus on manufacturing. By the way, this is the business model of Apple, right? So Apple designs the stuff in Cupertino and then sells us their stuff in these ritzy retail stores and outsources everything in the middle because there's no money in the bottom of the smile. Uniqlo does the same thing. They take some bets on what the fashion is going to be and then outsource the production of these things and then sell us these things in these hyper efficient retail stores. All right. So, um, so, so this sort of switch upstream into the higher margin, higher price, more powerful and dependency creating areas, I have in the Japanese version of the book labeled the Mai no Umi strategy because I think that um, sumo is actually a really great image for this thing. So those of you who've been around the block for a while, you may remember Konishiki. And Konishiki really is sort of here the example of the post-World War II Japanese businesses that were incentivized towards size by industrial policy and METI and trade wars and so forth and so on. And then after the bubble burst, it became clear that size is always good, but size alone won't cut it. That there needed to be something else because China will always be larger. No matter how big Japan's Konishiki is, China will always be bigger, right? So this takes us to sumo, and in addition to Konishiki, there was also Akebono, of course, both hailed from Hawaii. Akebono passed away last April, and the New York Times ran a obituary on him where they cited an interview they did many years ago, and he said, "We did it with brute strength. We just went into Japan and played sumo with brute strength." My favorite sumo at the time was actually Mai no Umi. He came to be known as the Waza no Depato, the department store of techniques. He was he was tiny in comparison, like a third the size. And also in terms of centimeters or inches, just small in comparison. But and you can see it here, that's Akebono. Mai no Umi managed to beat these guys with strategy and these waza. Waza is the sumo word for technique, right? But you could think of this as technologies. And so the Mai no Umi strategy is really a thing where, um, with size is good, but size alone will not win. So become a different athlete, a smarter athlete, a faster athlete, and so forth and so on. So by going upstream into these highly advanced input parts, that are difficult to make and difficult to copy, and Japan and China doesn't have them, and Korea doesn't have them, and Taiwan doesn't have them. I'll show you in a moment. That is a position of power. The challenge for normal people is you can't quite see that, right? Because it's inside. So your phone, your iPad, the screen you're looking at has a number of components in there from Japan, without which it would not be nearly as good, but you would never know. All right, so here's the evidences. I know this is a complicated chart, and some of you may have seen it, but basically what we're doing here is we're assessing the global market size vertically and the combined market share of Japanese companies horizontally. And so cars in orange, huge global industry. Japan's car makers, if you take the hybrids, the smaller dots, and this big block, Japan combines to about a third of that market. And then you see a bunch of bubbles. These are only 5 industries. So this is only cars and car parts and electronics and electronic parts, and biotech is pink. What I'm interested in, and by the way, this is not an academic study. This was done by METI and NEDO, which is an agency affiliated with METI, and um, they just picked 1,000 product items. And so this is not the universe. Then this does not. It's just an illustration, right? So let's make sure we don't over assess it. But what I was interested in was this Milky Way in the lower right hand corner, where there are all of these little industries, not so little by the way, 2.5 billion, 5 billion global market size, where Japan has almost 100 or over 60% of global market share. So I've called this in my Naomi strategy, and there are things like sensors, a lot of chemicals like photoresists for semiconductors and so forth. Okay, so now you might think, doesn't every country have this? And the answer is no. This is South Korea, no dots, Taiwan, semiconductors. China has a lot of stuff going on, but happily not yet in that Milky Way area there. But China is, of course, the biggest competitive threat in all of this. The United States has a lot of biotech because our regulations are a little less tough, and a lot of semiconductor, of course, always, and that's the teal bubbles, and some automobiles, yes. All right, and then the final chart of these is that we can see that there's a big difference between 2006 and 2016. All right, so that's just basically the story, and it's a large company story, and I want to stop here, actually. I want to stop in this final thing. This is my Naomi. He actually is little. And the book ends on sort of this hope message, or maybe for the global audience, and then I'll turn this off and join you here. A message that maybe we need to rethink what actually matters. And this whole thing of hunting down GDP growth and we're the biggest economy or the third biggest economy, is that really is economic growth really important, especially, by the way, if you're a shrinking society? And maybe going forward, what's more important is balance. A balance between economic growth and social stability, balance between ecology and economy, a balance between economic progress or technological progress and human well-being, that sort of thing. And I know that sounds a little bit, touchy-feely, but I'm actually quite serious about it. I mean, we all know that here in the US we are hurting right now. And I'm wondering whether that is because we've lost our balance. And I don't know what that balance is. I'm not saying Japan has that balance, right? Japan has a lot of bad things going for it as well, but it's an alternative model. And as such, I think it deserves a narrative that takes that alternative model at its basic assumptions, rather than using our American economics assumptions and assess it. So let me stop here. Way too long, but anyway.
My turn?
Yeah.
Cool.
For me.
I want to foot stomp for a second on that last point. I've been working extensively on economic security on the last couple of years, and the new book is a lot about that. And I was at a big conference in Hawaii last week on exactly the subject, or discussing the subject. And I think you're onto something. I mean, the conclusion that I've reached, and I sound foolish, feel foolish saying I always sound foolish, is the degree to which we don't do capitalism properly. And that in a world in which we're facing new types of threats, we've essentially lost the ability to price security. And I think what you're and I think of that in the context in which we've discussed it is typically in regard to resilience and supply chains, et cetera. But I think there's a more expansive definition that you're getting at. And that's precisely that one that essentially addresses security from a social perspective, which is oftentimes not part of the economic security discussion. So I would say don't be quite so reticent. I think there's something really big and important here. And I think that it's something that really deserves attention, but you better be careful because it's heretical as hell. And all the business schools are about to stomp you because what you're essentially saying is that a quarterly return on investment is no longer the be all end all of economic and managerial performance.
Yeah.
Cop?
Right. Right. And what's really interesting about this is that Japan has sort of tried to follow the global standards and the quarterly earnings and the activist shareholders and whatnot, but it's still not allowing these guys, well, as much as they can stop it, to destroy companies. Right? The other thing that I'll just throw in as an example for this choice is, do you remember I forget exactly when it was, I think around 2010, the Minshuto, the DPJ came into power. So this would have been the time, if you think back, when Japan came out of this post-bubble dilemma and was trying to turn itself around, right? Okay, and the criticism, and the reason the DPJ got into power, the criticism that we heard was not that Japanese companies were too slow to reform or reorganize or to exit. The criticism was they were thinking of hiring more non-regular employees. How could they? And the
Mm.
DPJ brought in all of these laws to increase the rights of and then the good laws, by the way. But so the criticism by society was these companies were making the employment system insecure. And we know, right, Japanese consumers can be really, really nasty. I mean, if they won't buy your hairdryer if you lay off people. And so there's something about that system that is at the face of it is very slow. But like, if I could say one more thing, you didn't ask for this, but while I want, so this balance thing, right? So in the Toyota production system, there is a core concept called heijunka, and it means like it's like leveling out. And the more I think about it, Toyota needed this because they had lifetime employment, and so they couldn't just make more cars when there was more demand and fewer cars when there was less demand. They just had to level out their production to keep everybody employed and used and utilized. The more I think about it, the more I think that Japan's definition of resilience in terms of the economy is resilient, or the society is resilient, is very different from the American definition. So in the United States, resilience is there's a shock, we all go, whoa, and then how long does it take us to go back to normal? And that is the textbook definition of resilience. In Japan, resilience is there's a shock, and how can we limit the damage it'll make? Can we put a line, or can we make sure that we don't do these wide swings, right? And then the Americans would say, oh, there's a wide swing. Okay, well, let's go back up. And so this leveling out of the flow, I think is sometimes, it's hard to see it, when you're in Japan and nothing is going, and there have to be five times we have to make sure that all is proper, or you have to confirm and confirm and confirm again, and all of that. But there's actually a benefit to that slow approach as well.
Yeah. And I think, another way of sort of saying that is interestingly, if you keep going to Japan every 6 months, you may not see it. You go to Japan once every 5 years, and you will note the changes. But I guess, there are two types of business books. One is a managerial study that says, okay, or is a study that says, let us help you understand this country and this industry that you're reading about. A second one says, here are lessons that we can apply. And I guess I would wonder, given what you've just explained about that, to what degree is the Japanese experience translatable to outside of Japan? Or does that never even enter your mind?
No, well, I wouldn't want to. I mean, I kind of end the book on that note, right? That if Japan can find this balance, and I think there is a Japanese way that actually may be an example of such a balance, other countries will like it. And I'm getting that feedback, right? So the book has been translated into Thai. I just got a request to give a talk in Malaysia. So there, and especially in Southeast Asia, there's ooh, wait, there may be something here that we can learn, and how other places think about this depends on their, country culture and speed and behaviors and whatnot, and their needs and whatnot. But just the fact that there is an alternative that is still capitalism, and not dog eat dog and kaksa shakai and all of these inequality and all this. Just the fact that there are alternatives to what America is doing, I think is in and of itself sort of inspiring to lots of places.
I guess there's another way to frame this, and John Nyland sort of gets to the point in the Q&A. Our friend John, hi John, um, is he talks about Japan stepping up as a global leader, and I think the way we think of that is that a country and an elite uses its economic power or its power, however defined, then to as grist for its international status and standing. And I think maybe what you're saying, and this is how one might conceivably reconcile Peak Japan with your book, is the degree to which Japan could then use this new model of social resilience as, if you will, a soft power platform to stand upon and demonstrate to the world alternative forms of political economy. And I know this is taking you out of your comfort zone, this little tiny world of business decisions. But it strikes me that there is a way to kind of bridge this gap, but it takes us into a fairly touchy-feely kind of area.
Well, it kind of does, right? Because it's sort of difficult to build a framework around that or whatever the business school would like. But I really do think that more and more people will look at Japan and say, well, wait a minute, isn't that the country that we were poo-pooing for its stagnant growth or its, the sort of fast changing prime ministers or something? And suddenly we look around, we look at Europe, and we look around the world and say, wow, maybe stable is actually much more valuable than we thought.
Yeah.
And
I noticed in the Q&A that John agrees with us, which means he is in fact as smart as we'd anticipated. Speaking, I guess to go back a little bit, as you've noticed, according to that Harvard, the Growth Lab, Japan has been in this position of number one. So what's up with that? How come no one is paying attention to it and giving it the credit? I mean, are you that smart and that unique? I mean, I suspected as much, but
of course, but I think our attention got diverted by China. And and then part of it is now we could talk about universities not hiring Japan experts, and and all of the retiring Japan experts were replaced by China experts, but business too, right? So this Japan Inside story, when I go and talk to semiconductor people, like the deep in the weeds semiconductor people, they know that they're 100% dependent on Japan for some stages of the production. Right? But if you go outside, people say, oh, the semiconductor is made in Taiwan, right? Or in the Netherlands or whatever. And then the answer is, yeah, but the machine that makes this thing or the chemical that goes there or the packaging, that's yeah. So the insiders know, but the outsiders don't. So it's difficult to see with the naked eye that this thing is 34% made in Japan. It says Apple. It's imported from China. And our trade statistics cannot figure this out. And our FDI statistics don't show it. So you actually have to talk to the industry insiders who know where they're sourcing their things to get there. And the economists that are studying trade are also handicapped because they have excellent trade data. But a lot of this is made on location, right? So Japan has, over the last 30 years, 40 years, built one of the largest global production networks. So the photoresists that Japan makes are made in, yes, Japan, and in Korea, and in the Netherlands, right? And so they're right, and in Taiwan, right next to where whatever the thing is that's being made. And the economists have a very difficult time figuring this out. So the data on this is difficult at best, if at all available, and therefore we don't have a lot of these stories. And it's difficult for people to write academic papers on things that they cannot measure, and it's difficult for journalists to write things on items that kind of go against their worldview, right? And the worldview is the US worldview. It's like strong economy is one with high GDP growth. And I think that sort of worldview we need to change if we
Ellis Krauss has noted in the Q&A that this is basically a different view of Schumpeterian creative destruction.
no, sometimes destruction is just destructive.
Right.
this whole creative destruction thing is an American view, or well, at the time it was of course German, um, of the idea is that somehow a baby can run faster than an old person, and then if you do this, and so you let the old person go, and you nurture the baby, the startup company, but companies are not people. They have no reason to die. You can change assets in an existing company, and it's not there's no reason for a company to die. All you need to do is be innovative, have a Minomi strategy, and exit the older businesses and enter new businesses. And in fact, a lot of the things that startups need, money, people, production assets, some office or, factory, the large companies have. So that the fact when large companies fail, that's actually a management failure, and there's no reason. They just need to pivot into new businesses.
So then what do you attribute the difference between the successes and the failures of the Japanese companies, the ones that do pivot and those that don't?
That's a leadership issue. We're in a very exciting time right now where there's a turnover of CEOs. And I don't mean by age or even what they look like, but by character. What type of person becomes a CEO? And so for this research, actually, I interviewed many, many, many. And it was a really great project because I got pretty good at, meeting a CEO and saying, that's a good one and that's not a good one. And so what makes a CEO a good CEO is a vision of where this ship is sailing. And if they have a vision and then the energy to actually change the direction and do this Umi pivot, they're doing great. And so the front runners that I've talked to are all these kind of places with a vision of what the next big thing is and how to get there. And so those are the companies that I write about. But it's case study after case study rather than some.
Significantly, you're crediting all this to the private sector. I mean, you're dismantling the legacy of your heir and of Japan's brilliant industrial strategy, and I hope you're not imperiling your support from Medi with this heretical work.
No, I was just invited to be a non-resident fellow at Rieti, so I think I'm good on the Meti side. No, no, the Meti story. I mean, both Thomas Johnson and I can be correct because Chal was writing about a time. Oh, it's possible. He was writing about a time when Japan was catching up. Catching up means you know the goal. You know where the goalpost is, and all you need to do is get the ball through that thing, right? And so the smart people of MITI at the time could actually just line up the ducks and then, and take some bets and kind of rally the troops to go there. Today, Japan being a competitor at the technology frontier, nobody knows what the next big thing is. We don't know what the goalpost is. We've caught up with America, we've caught up with Europe. What do we do now? Well, we have to invent. And the METI people don't know where the ship is going. They can help, right? And they're still helping, right? They can help, they can give tax breaks, they can give innovation, support, they can do things, but they don't know where the ship is going.
Now,
And
sorry, go ahead, finish your thought.
yeah, so it's hard. I mean, how do you do industrial policy if you don't know where you're going?
Welcome to the 21st century.
At least.
But so you said we're looking at an 80-20 split today, 20% of companies and the 80% sort of lagging behind. And you think that maybe Japan can move to 40-60. How do you see that expansion occurring? What do you anticipate might be the trigger? And I guess, and another way of looking at it is there a way that you can send the Japanese version of your book to all the CEOs in Keidanren and Keizo-do Yukai to get them to read it and perhaps, spread, which is also another way of asking as well, what's the reception to your argument being in Japan other than everybody translating your book into other languages?
Yeah, it's been quite the ride. I mean, I was in Japan 6 times last year. I just gave a talk at Keizai Doyukai 2 weeks ago. But yeah, I mean, it's getting traction. It's a bestseller. it's been a bestseller for a year now. I mean, it's going, and so it's a lot of fun. Yeah. I'm sorry. What was the first part of your question? I was
How do we expand the
how
20
we
to
expand that.
40%?
Yeah. So there are a couple of things in the immediate future. So first of all, for that, we need to know that there are lots and lots and lots of companies in Japan, and the reason is that the social welfare system is kind of baked into the Japanese economy, right? So rather than letting a small tatami maker, nobody buys tatami. We know that everybody wants it. There's some, right? We need tatami makers, but not as many as before. So rather than letting that go bankrupt, he can go, usually he, the tatami maker, can go to a regional bank or a Shinkin or something and get a government guaranteed loan. There's a government associated bank behind that stuff, and nobody really expects the tatami maker to maybe fully repay that thing. It's all a little bit interesting. And so the the idea is that in the United States, the poor guy or whatever goes bankrupt, he goes on the dole, as we call it, which nobody wants to do. It's not good for your personal esteem. And then, doesn't have anything to do and, drinks a lot of beer and watches a lot of football or something. So that's sort of the stereotype. The stereotype in Japan is the guy gets up in the morning, opens the store, makes a tatami that nobody wants to buy, but he's not at home getting drunk, beating up on his wife and that sort of thing, right? So there's a social stability story built into the corporate system.
Mhm.
The good news for the Japanese economy is that the average age of those CEOs is now something like 75. They started their business after World War II, right? And so we can soon go and celebrate, Gokuro-sama, Tsukare-sama, thank you for your contribution, and let them retire without them losing any of their dignity. So that's part of its aging. The second part is that the ones that are in the middle that are muddling through, right? Sort of they get a loan, but they're not really profitable, and they putter along, and they're not contributing to GDP growth. They're not going bankrupt. They're just meh. And those meh places are going to go out of business for two reasons that are actually probably, it'll sound a little harsh, but at the end of the day, again, it'll be kind of a polite, soft kind of thing. But there are two things happening right now. There's a labor shortage, which is already acute. So if you run a company that has no vision and no purpose and no direction, you will soon find yourself without employees. And the second thing is interest rates are up, right? Just yesterday, the Bank of Japan raised them again. Suddenly, after 20 years, the period of cheap money is over. So if you want to bank, the old days, if you wanted a bank loan, you could get one for 0.5%, whatever, right? And you can probably make enough money to repay that. But if your bank loan is suddenly 5%, you actually have to do something. Right. And so this is like medium-sized companies that are puttering through the economy, right? And so as they sort of wrap up, let's say, this is much less of a problem than you might think because their employees can go elsewhere because of the labor shortage.
Mm.
So until now, the labor shortage has been the biggest plug for companies to either go or get better. But with the labor shortage coming in, there'll be a little bit more heat. And so people will move into the companies that are, that have a vision and a mission. And it won't touch the stability because of this labor shortage. It's a very lucky, sort of moment that the labor shortage is happening at this time.
I want to make a statement. I don't know that you need to respond because I want to cover the self-publishing piece that you and I
Oh,
discussed.
yeah.
But it occurs to me as well that, as you just mentioned, there was a particular set of external circumstances that made this possible. It's precisely a zero interest rate environment. And I'm wondering to what degree does slow but stable, do those parameters change when suddenly you've got pressure from interest rates and a slightly less accommodating external economic environment?
Maybe not. I think I could probably write an academic paper on that because the slow started when there was doing the aftermath of the bursting bubble at the turn of the century. It was a really
Mm,
bad and there weren't a lot of bank loans available. And still, companies stayed alive because the government had this program, partially, and partially because society wanted employment, right? So employment was the thing. And and that is actually the employment is the biggest plug. So we already see tenshaku, right? Changing jobs is a new hot thing. Already suddenly people realize it's not all that great, right? So maybe I should stay. There's a whole cottage industry around lubricating that, emerging. It's very interesting. But the biggest part for companies was you can't close down a business unit as long as there are employees in there. And so they did it by attrition. They just waited until the last employee hired was retiring. And then they said, okay, now we're exiting this business. And I think that it's like cleaning up your garage by throwing away one item a week, right? But after 30 years of throwing away one item per week, your garage will actually be clean. So right, so and we're at that point
okay.
where more and more companies have a pretty clean garage where their business units are in areas where they can actually make money and want to be in. And so it just took a lot of time. I think it'll speed up.
Okay. Well, it'll be interesting. We're entering a very intriguing period, and we're also entering towards the end of the conversation. You and I both talked about the importance, or wanted to discuss the self-publishing feature, and I mean it's kind of interesting for a person of your stature, Dr. Shada, to to indulge in self-publication. What, you couldn't find anybody that would publish your book? So I mean, I think this is interesting, and I think it's important, but I would care to kind of tell the audience and why you chose this route?
Yeah, so first of all, you came up with the idea, but I credit where credit goes. So the whole thing is a little bit serendipitous, and I have no regrets. I would do it slightly differently now that I know what I'm knowing. But the first step in this logic was that I published the Japanese book first, which is actually rare. And I'm grateful to my publisher Nikkei that they actually took that gamble, right? And so, okay, so we have this Japanese book, and then I was like, oh, look what I found. Yeah, I own the copyright. What do I do with this? And then we met and discussed, what would be the value added of a book publisher at this day and age? Right? So I could tell you what the book publishers used to do. There was a copy editor and an editor, and the editor would tell you to make the book better, right? Charles Johnson's famous paper on how his editor at Stanford University Press told him to come up with a developmental state introduction, right? But that's in good old days. That rarely happens in academic publishing today. Then there should be the copy editor, but they're outsourced. That's being outsourced now. The ChatGPT can do a better job at copy editing than almost, not quite. And so that value add is gone. Then the final value added for an academic is that we get credentials for publishing in a university press, which is an important thing, and something the university presses are playing up. Happily, I'm at a stage of my career where, I have written enough. I've written 9 books, so the marginal contribution of the 10th book to my career trajectory is like, almost nothing. So I thought, well, I'd try this. It's also a small book, right? So that's the other thing. It's 40,000 words, not the normal 80,000. And then I thought, wow, wait a minute. If I do it, or we thought, right? If I do it myself, it's out. And that is actually the best part, right? So I don't have a copy editor. There's some typos in it. I know. 2 or 3 somebody found. So I will open it back up, change the typos, and release it again. If you buy the print version, it will actually be printed on demand. So this book is not sitting in any warehouse. It's printed on demand, and it actually miraculously shows up within 3 days. I have no idea. If it's in Tokyo, it's printed in Saitama. If you order it here, it's printed in Las Vegas. It's amazing.
How much is it?
So then I get the pricing power, right? And so you and I are still in crosshairs whether it should be $4.99 or $5.99 for the Kindle version. And then
I want the record to show that I'm for the cheaper version.
yeah, and I did a lot of surveys, and people said if it's too cheap, it looks cheap, which is also true, right? And a latte in California is now something like $6.99 or something if you get a good one. So it's less than a latte. In Japan, it's less than a ramen, still.
Yes.
Right? So it's less than a ramen. The paper bag is something like $9.99, which is still actually less than a, a lunch sandwich here. But then actually, also from an author's perspective, for me, the royalties is the same no matter what format you buy. So Amazon makes a ton of money on the hardcover and a little bit of money on the paperback, and they're actually reasonable on the e-version. I don't know what my colleagues are going to say about this. I think they'll just be happy that I'm publishing, and the book was listed as number one in international economics books in Amazon Japan last week. So it's having an impact. It's being bought. So I mean that's great.
To me, the best part about the pricing and the availability is that you really don't have an excuse not to buy it. And if people, I mean, people that want to do classes in Japan business should be, you can assign this book with a clear conscience and require every student to buy it and not feel like you're breaking the bank. For me, that's just what really commends the model. If you're in, of course, the position you're in, to be able to forego the peer review and maybe even the economic the benefits. But I'm your experience is I think it's important, and I would just flag for the audience something to really think about. And we're thinking of starting our own little publishing mark, but
Yeah,
that
I
was
think the model is broken. So if we can come up with a better idea of how we can put some quality control onto the Amazon model, I think that would be ideal, or some imprimatur of, yeah, this is good stuff, right? Because there's a lot of books on Amazon. And there's also a cottage industry around helping you to publish it. I would recommend against engaging with those people. It's actually not as easy as you might think it is, but it's not that difficult. I made some mistakes, but they're all correctable. And in terms of pricing, I mean the publishers have really gotten rapacious. I mean, what's your Routledge book selling for?
don't even go there. It's yes, it's quite painful.
Nobody can afford it, right? And so their business model is the libraries will buy it, and then the libraries will give open access to the students, and that's it, right? But I mean, we at so my Stanford University Press book is available to students online and whatnot. By the way, that's still selling also. I mean, that's actually kind of interesting. But this one, yeah, I mean, people can just buy it, and it's $5.99. It's not gonna break the
Right.
bank, and the students can buy it, and um uh you know in whatever format.
What to go back to the substances we because I don't want to peter out. I want to end on a strong note. What has been as you go back to Japan and you give the talks about the book, are you finding that Japanese are pleased to get the recognition that they want? Does this encourage them to think about change? How do you see the impact of the book and I guess the original Japanese version impacting Japan and Japanese business and management?
Yeah, I think I was just really fortunate that I hit a zeitgeist sort of moment with this. I think that the younger people are tired of the dame dameron. Japan is bad. Japan is going to fail. And I think they're just a lot of people in Japan are tired of the negative story. There's actually probably going to be my next book. There's also something about hunting this global standard, which is the American way of doing things, and being told that Japan will never be good enough to really fulfill the global standard. They're tired of that. So that is sort of the core group that this stuff is speaking to. I'm surprised that a lot of managers like it, and they like it because they're looking for ways to motivate their employees and to change, right? So some people just like so this idea of calling it Mai no Umi and using a sumo image, which is of course a Japanese sport, which I didn't even think of, but that is, oh, it's our sport, and she's using our sport as an image for this. It didn't even occur to me. I just liked Mai no Umi and thought he was great. But there is I think it resonates with people that we need to, if we want to go forward in some way, shape, or form, we need to have our own narrative of our own path and what we're doing, and not constantly just, um, beat ourselves up over the fact that we're not like America.
That's is a fairly radical position for the Japanese to adopt. I mean, since so much of history has been a function of having, if you will, that model in front of them and racing to try to best it on its own terms.
Right. And then of course this pessimism is like really deep seated. So a lot of people come, oh yeah, I like your book, but but we Japanese can't do this, or at the end of the day, we can't do that, or something. And so there's a lot. The pessimism is very deep seated. So you open the newspaper and there's an article, oh, the Nikkei 225 is higher than it's ever been. Oh, but that must be bad. It must come down soon, right? So it always ends on a negative thing. And so there's a deeply ingrained sort of resistance to this, but to the good news. But since I have the data, I mean, the one feedback I get is that, yeah, they've heard other people being optimistic about Japan or being, happy that Japan is such a great place and so forth. But because I have the data and the framework, people are much more willing to engage in this kind of conversation, I think.
Well, I think it's one of the things that is intriguing is just the degree to which you've always dug so deep into the data and used that to guide your analysis rather than merely relying, if you will, on the conceptions and the preconceptions and the sort of at least the stated and unstated assumptions. And it also makes it really difficult to argue with you when we're drinking.
Ah, sorry. But you always find a way to give me a hard time. So it's like,
And
yeah.
I appreciate it. And they're always fun. I mean, we're approaching the end of the hour, and I don't want to push you on. I mean, is there anything that you anything else you want to add, I suppose, in terms of the message and the thinking about what you're going to do next, where you anticipate taking your research, or things that we should be looking at, perhaps, or in slightly different direction? Do you worry about the political moment shaping or impacting the larger business environment about which you write?
Well, so this Mai-no-Umi strategy is actually has put Japan in a real position of power as this whole decoupling or tariffs or something, because so many of the things that Japan makes now is really needed in other places. What I'm a little bit concerned about is that Japan may be driven to be more engaged in Northeast Asia than other parts of the world for that purpose, right? And so is that good for the balance in the world? I don't know. I mean, but I'll just keep sticking to my knittings. Right? So I'm working on a new book on how CEOs in Japan can actually change the internal workings of their companies and the HR systems. And there's some frameworks that can be beautifully applied to Japan. I'm writing some case studies on Japanese companies, and I'm also thinking about some other projects that I'll share maybe next year.
I
We'll
was about
have.
to say, so we should be reserving another Zoominar in January of next year when we had when your next book is out,
Well, we definitely should do that. Yeah. So
right?
yeah. So thank you, Brad. I mean, this was really great, and thank you for joining me and for suggesting that I do this Amazon thing and for telling me the book's actually worth publishing. So thank you.
Well, the book's great. If anyone who on the call who hasn't read it yet, buy the book. No reason not to, and read the book. It won't take you long, and you will be infinitely smarter, better informed for having done so. It's a wonderful read.
Thank you, Brad. Thank you, audience. This is it for today, and we'll see you in next month, actually, I guess, sometime in late March. Until then,
Cheers.
stay well. Bye-bye.